Joining me now is former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff. He's now chairman and co-founder of the Chertoff Group, a consulting firm that focuses on national security issues. Thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it. If you were still heading the Department of Homeland Security, which is obviously intimately involved in this investigation, what questions would you be asking the FBI and investigators right now about these three individuals that were arrested today?
The first thing you want to know is there another threat out there? So you want to ascertain, are these three people actually involved in any way in the preparation and carrying out of the bombing attack? You want to look to see were there other connections that the Tsarnaevs had to people in the U.S. who might have been facilitators. You want to see what the connections were overseas. Were they trained in Russia? Were they inspired in Russia or in Chechnya? And you need to do this in order to make sure that you're preventing another plot from being carried out. That's priority number one.
Having been at the Department of Homeland Security during 2005 to 2009, right, when some of these plots were foiled and other operations took place, what is your suspicion? I don't, obviously, we don't want to go into irresponsible speculation, but when it comes to the likelihood that two individuals were able to do this entirely on their own, it seems like even if the bombs were relatively crude, it's more sophisticated a bomb than I could make, and it does seem like a rather sophisticated operation.
It also seems like it was planned out. It appears, at least based on reporting, that there were other devices, they had guns, so it wasn't something that was spur of the moment. It required a certain amount of planning. The question in my mind is what happened over there in Russia. You would normally expect, and we saw during the time that I was in office, many of these plots involved a component of somebody going overseas, training in a camp or training with somebody and then bringing that back home. And that's why if I were looking at this as an investigator, I'd put a lot of focus on what happened in the Caucasus during that 6 months or so that the elder brother was back there.
Do you think that there was, looking at what we know about the pre-attack intelligence, that there was a warning by the Russians to the FBI about Tamerlan Tsarnaev, to the CIA about 6 months later in 2011, he went to Russia, to Chechnya, Dagestan, came back. There was no ping. No flag was raised. Was there a failure of information sharing at the very least, or what we all talked about after 9/11, using our imaginations at the very most?
Well, you know, the structures are there to share information. The law is there to share information. Obviously, there was a failure in that somebody missed this. Now, it may be an excusable failure or an understandable failure, but it's not a success when people die. The question here is, should you have tracked this person when they came back and re-interviewed them? Obviously, when a foreign service takes the trouble twice to send a message to agencies, you have to take it seriously.
And how often do the Russians do that?
Well, it's not unknown, but it's not common. And anytime a foreign service makes a specific request with a particular name, it suggests that they have some knowledge based on some overseas activity.
Now, the FBI complained, we went back to them for more information, and they did not cooperate. And you heard President Obama yesterday talking about how cooperative the Russians have been since the attacks, the implication being that not so much before the attacks. Does this Cold War mentality that President Obama talked about, does it still hamper relations between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, it appears to have been a problem in this case, but it really shouldn't. You know, we've had relations with countries around the world which have been pretty rocky, and yet on the counterterrorism level, it's been very, very good cooperation. Even when I was in office at times that some other countries were not necessarily seeing eye to eye on Iraq or other issues, at the law enforcement level, there was always a lot of exchange of information because it's mutually important. It's as important to the Russians as it is to us. So I would put some emphasis on making sure that our relationships with the Russians or anybody else at this level are being maintained properly, and so there's a good flow of cooperation.
I've heard talk that one of the reasons why it might not have gone as swimmingly as it should have been is because Russia is always trying to convince the U.S. that the Chechens, with whom they're involved in this ugly, bloody war for years and years, they're always trying to convince the U.S. that the Chechens are our enemy, and the U.S. is very wary of ever getting dragged into that conflict. Do you think that I mean, is that accurate, that is a tension?
Well, I mean, it certainly causes you to be careful, but I want to go back historically. If you go back to the early 90s, Europeans went to Chechnya to fight. They came back to Europe, and they became terrorists in Europe. We saw that in France and other parts of Western Europe. So there is a history of people going to the region and coming back radicalized. Again, you wouldn't necessarily take it at face value, but you can't really ignore it either. You've got to drill into it. And that's frankly what the job of the security folks every single day is, to really kick the tires and make sure they're extracting every bit of information they can.